Get out of the vehicle and put your dirty hands on the hood, boy. Cars like this don't belong to people who look like you unless they stole 'em. Marcus did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, nor did he tighten his grip on the mahogany steering wheel. He simply sat in the driver's seat of the vintage sports car, his breathing as steady and rhythmic as the ticking of his watch, his faded gray sweatshirt bunching slightly at his broad shoulders. He looked at the police officer through the open window, his expression a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. He knew the officer's body camera was recording. He knew the dashboard camera of the cruiser idling behind him was capturing every frame of the encounter. He knew exactly what was about to happen next, and he understood with perfect, crystalline clarity that the man standing outside his window was currently throwing away his pension, his freedom, and his entire 22-year career in the span of a single afternoon. But to understand what happened on the shoulder of that affluent suburban road, you need to go back to a cramped, drafty kitchen in East Detroit 35 years ago. The morning air in the town of Oak Ridge always smelled of wealth. It was a specific, curated scent equal parts blooming jasmine, damp, freshly manicured fescue grass, and the faint, metallic tang of expensive sprinkler systems working in unison. Oak Ridge was an enclave, a fortress of sprawling estates, private tennis courts, and iron gates, tucked away from the noise and grit of the surrounding county. It was a place where belonging was signaled by the make of your vehicle, the subtle weave of your golf shirt, and the unblemished whiteness of your skin. Marcus Hayes woke up at 4:30 a.m., long before the golden afternoon light would eventually bathe the town's immaculate avenues. He moved through the kitchen of his newly rented, modest townhome on the outskirts of the municipal limits. The house was still filled with cardboard moving boxes, their flaps folded in tightly over decades of accumulated life. Marcus didn't turn on the overhead lights. He navigated by the faint, blue glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. His morning ritual never varied. It was the anchor that held his world in place. He filled an electric kettle with filtered water. He reached for a manual grinder, pouring in exactly 22 grams of dark, oily Ethiopian coffee beans. As his hands gripped the handle, the cracked skin around his knuckles, a testament to a lifetime of rebuilding engines and working with his hands, caught the dim light. He turned the crank, the grinding of the beans a harsh, rhythmic crunch in the silent kitchen. The rich, earthy smell of the coffee blossomed in the air, briefly overpowering the lingering scent of cardboard and packing tape. While the water heated, Marcus sat at the small wooden table. He opened a worn, leather-bound notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulously dated entries, written in a tight, disciplined script. He uncapped his pen and wrote the date Saturday, May 2. Beneath it, he wrote a single line, a quote from his late mother Eleanor. "Dignity isn't given, Marcus. It's a fortress you build inside yourself, and no one can breach it unless you hand them the key." Eleanor Hayes had spent 40 years cleaning the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of downtown municipal buildings. Her hands had always smelled of cocoa butter and the harsh, biting lemon and ammonia of industrial floor cleaner. She had never raised her voice in anger, never begged for a living wage, and never cried where the world could see her. She had taught Marcus that reacting to ignorance was a tax on his spirit that he simply could not afford to pay. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, the bitter warmth grounding him. He looked down at his clothes. He was wearing a faded, oversized gray hoodie from his alma mater, a pair of worn and denim jeans stained with Axle grease at the left knee, and a pair of scuffed, second-hand work boots. It was his day off. More accurately, it was the final day of his anonymity. On Monday morning at 900 a.m. sharp, Marcus Hayes would be standing in front of the mayor, the city council, and the local press, placing his hand on a Bible. He was the incoming, newly appointed chief of police for the Oak Ridge Police Department, brought in by a federal mandate to clean up a precinct plagued by a decade of civil rights lawsuits and systemic corruption. But today he was just a man going to check on his car. The car was his singular indulgence. It was a flawlessly restored 1967 Jaguar E-Type Series 1. He had found it rusting in a barn in rural Pennsylvania 15 years ago. Slowly, painfully, on a civil servant's salary, he had rebuilt it piece by piece. He knew every bolt, every wire, every idiosyncrasy of the inline-six engine. The interior smelled of aged Connolly leather and motor oil. It was a masterpiece of British engineering, painted a deep, lustrous British racing green. Across town, at the Oak Ridge Precinct headquarters, Officer Ray Dempsey was starting his shift. Dempsey was a man who wore his authority like a bludgeon. He stood by the coffee machine in the break room, the scent of stale, burned coffee mingling with the cheap, overwhelmingly sharp cologne he sprayed on his neck every morning. Dempsey's uniform was tailored slightly too tight across his chest, a deliberate choice to emphasize his bulk. A heavy, silver knockoff dive watch hung loosely on his thick wrist. Dempsey was a creature of the old guard. He believed in instinct. He believed in order. Most specifically, he believed in his own unwritten rules about who belonged in Oak Ridge and who did not. He leaned against the counter, chewing a piece of peppermint gum with a slow, aggressive rhythm. "Quiet morning," muttered Officer Tyler Vance, a rookie who had been on the force for exactly 11 months. Vance was nervously checking the ink in his pens, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Vance was the kind of cop who was terrified of making a mistake, which made him dangerous, but more importantly, made him malleable in the hands of men like Dempsey. "It's quiet because we keep it quiet, Vance." Dempsey sneered, tossing his empty paper cup into the trash. "You keep the element out, the town stays nice. It ain't complicated. You just gotta know what doesn't fit the picture." Dempsey adjusted his duty belt, the heavy leather creaking under his weight. He didn't know that the Department of Justice had been auditing his arrest records for the past 18 months. He didn't know that his name was highlighted in red ink in a dossier currently sitting on the desk of the incoming chief of police. Dempsey only knew that he had a badge, a gun, and a cruiser, and in Oak Ridge, that made him a king. At 20:14 p.m., the golden afternoon light of Oak Ridge was broken by the sharp, violent burst of red and blue LED lights. Marcus had been driving down Elmwood Avenue, the most exclusive residential corridor in the city. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy over the meticulously paved street. The Jaguar was purring, the exhaust note a low, confident growl. Marcus was relaxed, the window rolled down, the cool breeze washing over his face. He was driving below the speed limit, enjoying the mechanical symphony of the vehicle he had spent thousands of hours bringing back to life. In his rearview mirror, the police cruiser materialized aggressively. It had been parked behind a dense hedge near the entrance of the country club. The moment Marcus had driven past, the cruiser lurched forward, accelerating rapidly until it was riding dangerously close to the Jaguar's chrome bumper. Marcus checked his speedometer. He was doing 28 in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. His registration was current. His tags were properly affixed. His taillights were fully functional. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold mahogany of the steering wheel against his palms. He knew the protocol. He engaged his right turn signal, smoothly guided the priceless classic car onto the shoulder of the road, and shifted the transmission into neutral. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. He rolled down his window completely. He placed his hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel, at the 10 and 2 positions. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not rummage through the glove compartment. He sat completely still. In the side mirror, he watched the door of the cruiser open. Officer Ray Dempsey stepped out. The heavy thud of his boots on the asphalt was deliberate and slow. Behind him, Rookie Officer Vance stepped out of the passenger side, hanging back near the trunk of the cruiser, his hand resting nervously on his radio. The scent of Dempsey's cheap cologne and the faint, sour smell of old bourbon seeping from his pores arrived before he did. Dempsey stopped just behind the driver's side door, angling his body to maintain a tactical advantage. He leaned down, placing a heavy, gloved hand onto the pristine, polished roof of the Jaguar. Marcus noted the action. It was an assertion of dominance, a deliberate disrespect of the property. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Dempsey asked. His voice was a flat, abrasive bark. "I do not, officer," Marcus replied. His tone was perfectly level, devoid of any inflection, anger, or fear. It was the voice of a man reciting the weather. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Don't make any sudden movements. My wallet is in my right back pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now," Marcus said calmly. "Just get the paper, buddy, and do it slow." Marcus reached back, retrieved his worn leather wallet, and extracted his standard civilian driver's license. His police credentials, his federal identification, and his newly minted gold chief's badge were securely locked in a fireproof safe back at his townhouse. He handed the license out the window. He then leaned over, opened the glove compartment, and retrieved the paperwork for the vehicle. Dempsey snatched the documents. He looked at the name on the license. Marcus Hayes. He looked at the address. It was the townhome complex on the border of the city, nowhere near the sprawling estates of Elmwood Avenue. He looked down at Marcus's faded hoodie, his grease-stained jeans, his weathered hands. He looked back at the deep, flawless paint of the Jaguar. The arithmetic in Dempsey's head resolved into a singular, ugly conclusion. "This is a very nice car, Marcus," Dempsey said, letting the first name hang in the air, a deliberate breach of professional respect. "Thank you," Marcus said, his eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield. "Where'd you get it?" "I restored it." Dempsey let out a short, harsh laugh. It was the sound of a man who had already made up his mind. "You restored it, right?" A guy from the border apartments who looks like he just crawled out of a dumpster restoring a $100,000 piece of British hardware. That's a good story. It is the truth, officer. Step out of the vehicle and put your dirty hands on the hood, boy. Cars like this don't belong to people who look like you unless they stole M. The word hung in the air. Boy, it was a word steeped in centuries of venom, designed to shrink a man, to strip him of his adulthood, his agency, his humanity. Marcus did not react. A vein did not throb in his neck. His hands did not shake. He simply opened the door, the hinges silent and smooth, and stepped out onto the asphalt. He was 3 inches taller than Dempsey, but he did not use his height to intimidate. He walked slowly to the front of the Jaguar and placed his hands flat on the warm green metal of the hood. The metal was smooth beneath his palms. Traffic continued to roll past them on Elmwood Avenue, and silver Range Rover slowed down. The woman behind the wheel, wearing oversized sunglasses, stared out at the scene. Marcus could hear the distinct, electronic clack of her doors automatically locking as she passed. A man jogging on the opposite sidewalk with a golden retriever stopped. He didn't call out to ask if everything was all right. He pulled his smartphone from his armband, tapped the screen, and began recording the interaction. He was not filming to protect Marcus. He was filming the spectacle of a black man being subdued in a wealthy neighborhood. "Spread your legs," Dempsey ordered, stepping up behind Marcus. Marcus complied. Dempsey began a pat-down search. It was unnecessarily rough. He kicked Marcus's right ankle to widen his stance, the toe of his boot striking hard against the bone. He dragged his hands up Marcus's legs around his waist, checking his pockets. "I'm running these plates, Marcus," Dempsey said, his breath hot against the back of Marcus's neck. "And when this comes back flagged, you're going away for a long time. You people come into this town thinking you can just take what isn't yours. Not on my watch." Behind the cruiser, Officer Vance shifted uncomfortably. He looked around at the gathering onlookers. He looked at the pristine car. He looked at Marcus, who was standing with the quiet, immovable stillness of a mountain. "Hey, Ray," Vance called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe we should just run the plates in the system before we, he's not resisting." Dempsey spun around, his face flushing dark red. "Shut your mouth, Vance! I'm the senior officer on this scene. This suspect is uncooperative and hostile. I know exactly what I'm looking at." Dempsey unclipped his radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have a 1015 on Elmwood and 4th. Grand theft auto suspect. Refusing to comply. I need a supervisor on scene immediately, and send a flatbed tow truck. We're impounding this vehicle." Marcus felt the warm sun on the back of his neck. He looked down at the gleaming chrome of the Jaguar's bumper. He noted the flashing red light of the body camera mounted on Dempsey's chest. He noted the angle of the dashcam in the cruiser. Very slowly, moving only his left thumb, he pressed the small, tactile button on the side of his Apple Watch, activating the voice memo recording app. He was gathering data. He was cataloging the evidence. "You're making a mistake, Officer Dempsey," Marcus said quietly. It was the first time he had used the officer's name. Dempsey scoffed, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The heavy metal links clinked together. A sharp, violent sound in the quiet afternoon air. "The only mistake here was you thinking you could drive this through my town. Put your hands behind your back." Marcus brought his hands behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the cuffs snapped around his wrists. They were ratcheted tight, biting into the skin over his pulse points. He was a 50-year-old man, a decorated veteran of the Department of Justice, a man with 2 master's degrees, standing handcuffed on the side of the road in his own city, simply because of the color of his skin. He thought of his mother. Dignity isn't given, it's a fortress. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his face an unreadable mask. He would let the system break itself upon him. 14 agonizing minutes passed. 14 minutes of cars slowing down, of neighbors peering through their wrought iron gates, of whispered judgments and averted eyes. Dempsey leaned against the side of his cruiser, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered across his face. He made a show of ignoring Marcus, chatting casually with Vance about a baseball game, projecting absolute, unquestioned dominance. Then the heavy, low hum of a Ford Explorer Interceptor broke the ambient noise of the street. It rounded the corner at high speed, its lights flashing, and pulled to a sharp halt directly behind Dempsey's cruiser. The tires barked against the pavement. The door opened, and Captain David Sterling stepped out. Sterling was a 30-year veteran of the force. He was the acting commander of the precinct, the man holding the reins until the new chief arrived on Monday. He was a stern, meticulous man who commanded absolute respect from the rank and file. "What do we have here, Dempsey?" Sterling called out, adjusting his duty belt as he walked toward the scene. "Dispatch said you had a combative GTA suspect. Got him right here, Captain." Dempsey Puffing out his chest, he gestured toward Marcus with a lazy flick of his hand, pulled him over. He got hostile. Story doesn't add up, claims he owns this Jag. I've got a tow truck on the way. Sterling walked past the cruiser. He walked past the nervous rookie Vance. He stepped around the gleaming rear of the Jaguar. He raised his eyes to look at the suspect handcuffed against the hood. Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. The physical transformation of Captain Sterling was instantaneous and absolute. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a pallid ashen gray. His jaw went slack. The confident swagger in his posture vanished, replaced by the rigid, terrifying stillness of a man who has just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Sterling had spent the last 2 weeks in intensive, closed-door transition meetings with the Department of Justice. He had sat across a mahogany table from the man tasked with saving his department from federal receivership. He knew exactly what the man looked like. The ambient noise of the street seemed to evaporate. The wind stopped rustling the oak leaves. The passing cars seemed to mute themselves. The silence that descended on the shoulder of Elmwood Avenue was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. "Captain," Dempsey asked, his smug smile faltering slightly at the sight of his commander's pale face. "You okay?" Sterling did not look at Dempsey. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a strained, hollow whisper that barely carried over the idling engine of the cruiser. "Officer Dempsey, take the cuffs off." Dempsey frowned, confused. "Captain, he's a flight risk. The vehicle is. Take the goddamn cuffs off him right now!" Sterling roared. The sudden, violent explosion of volume made Vance jump backward. It echoed off the manicured hedges. Dempsey, visibly startled, fumbled for his keys. He stepped behind Marcus, his hand suddenly trembling. He inserted the key, turned it, and the heavy steel cuffs fell away with a clatter. Marcus slowly brought his arms forward. He rubbed his wrists, massaging the deep red indentations left by the steel. He turned around slowly. He looked at Sterling. He looked at Dempsey. "Captain." Dempsey stammered, his eyes darting back and forth. "I don't understand. Who? What's going on?" Sterling finally turned to Dempsey. The look in the captain's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated horror and disgust. "Dempsey, you ignorant, miserable fool. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Sterling turned back to Marcus, swallowed hard, and stood at strict attention. "Chief Hayes." "Sir, I have no words to explain this." The silence returned, heavier this time. It hit Dempsey physically. The arrogant posture collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward. His knees genuinely seemed to buckle, forcing him to lean a hand against his cruiser to stay upright. The blood rushed from his head, leaving his skin clammy and cold. The man in the worn hoodie, the man he had called boy, the man he had thrown against the hood of a car, was Marcus Hayes, the incoming chief of police. The man sent by the federal government to root out corruption. Marcus stepped away from the car. He smoothed the front of his sweatshirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It possessed the gravitational pull of a black hole. It was calm, factual, and utterly devastating. "You walked up to MY vehicle," Marcus began, his eyes locking onto Dempsey's wide, terrified pupils. "You scrutinized MY presence on a public street. You weaponized war authority to stroke your own ego." Marcus took one slow step forward. Dempsey shrank back against the cruiser. "And when you saw a black man in a space you felt you owned, driving a vehicle you believed I had no right to possess, the very first thing you did was try to strip me of my humanity. You didn't ask questions. You made accusations. You didn't investigate. You humiliated." Marcus gestured toward the flashing red light on Dempsey's chest. "You thought you were protected by that badge. You thought you were protected by this town. I didn't resist you, Officer Dempsey. I didn't break the law. You broke your oath. And you documented your own destruction." Dempsey opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, to reframe the nightmare. "Chief, it was a misunderstanding. The profile of the vehicle. I was just following protocol." "There is no misunderstanding." Marcus cut him off, his voice slicing through the excuse like a scalpel. "Protocol does not dictate calling a citizen boy. Protocol does not dictate physical assault without provocation. You did not make a mistake, Dempsey. You operated exactly as you were trained to operate by your own prejudice. And that ends today." Marcus turned to Captain Sterling. "Captain, relieve Officer Dempsey of his duty weapon, his badge, and his radio. He is suspended immediately, without pay pending termination." "Yes, sir," Sterling said without hesitation. He unlatched Dempsey's belt himself. "Officer Vance," Marcus said, turning to the trembling rookie. Vance snapped to attention, his face pale. "Yes, sir." "You saw an injustice occurring. You attempted, however weakly, to intervene. You will write a full, unredacted report of everything you witnessed here today. Do not omit a single word. Your career depends on your honesty in the next 2 hours. Understood?" "Yes, Chief." "I understand." Marcus turned back to his Jaguar. He opened the door, slid into the rich leather seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a magnificent, triumphant sound. He put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the three officers standing on the side of the road in the wake of the wreckage Dempsey had created. The justice that followed was not swift and fiery. It was bureaucratic, methodical, and absolute. Within 72 hours, the body cam footage had been reviewed by the Department of Justice Oversight Committee. Ray Dempsey was formally terminated from the Oak Ridge Police Department. Because the termination was categorized under a federal civil rights violation, Dempsey was stripped of his pension, a sum totaling roughly $1.2 million in projected retirement assets. But Marcus did not stop with one bad cop. The incident provided the exact undeniable leverage he needed. In his first 90 days as chief, Marcus instituted sweeping policy changes. The discretionary loophole Dempsey had used to pull him over was permanently closed. An independent civilian review board was established, armed with subpoena power and funded by a reallocation of the department's tactical budget. The dashboard and body camera audit logs were automated and sent directly to a third-party server, untouchable by precinct captains. 6 months later, Marcus Hayes sat on the porch of his newly purchased home, well within the borders of Oak Ridge. It was evening. The air smelled of jasmine and impending rain. He sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair, a mug of hot Ethiopian coffee resting on his knee. He watched his teenage grandson, Elijah, carefully polishing the chrome bumper of the Jaguar in the driveway. "Make sure you get under the rim," Marcus called out softly. "The dirt hides where you don't look." "I got it, Grandpa," the boy smiled back. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. The fortress remained intact. The injustice in this story wasn't just that an innocent man was pulled over. It was the chilling reality that a badge was used as a weapon to enforce a racial boundary line. What made this reckoning so powerful wasn't the twist of Marcus's hidden identity. It was his unshakable commitment to his own dignity. He didn't let the ignorance of another man dictate his emotional state. He remained perfectly calm, forcing the corrupt system to expose its own rot on camera. Think about your own life. Have you ever let someone else's desperate need to belittle you cause you to lose your peace? Have you ever surrendered your composure to someone who didn't deserve your energy? If this story reminded you of your own strength, or if you know someone who is currently fighting to maintain their dignity in a space that refuses to see their worth, share this video with them right now. Send it to that person who needs to hear that their power lies in their peace. Subscribe to this channel as we continue our series exploring real stories of justice, systemic accountability, and the unyielding power of self-respect. Because true authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs the quiet courage to stand in its own truth. Remember that. True authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs the quiet courage to stand in its own truth. Remember that.